Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So great to see everyone today. We're so excited to be here with you. I'm Tracy Wilson, and I'm joined by my partners, Liz Devine and Denise DeMello. We're all retired public school teachers. Liz and I were high school teachers in West Hartford, and Denise is a retired library media specialist. We've been working together for 7 years, uncovering the stories of slavery and freedom lost to United States and Connecticut history, bringing the history to students and having them help us amplify these stories. Liz and I would say that our approach to teaching U.S. history has really been transformed in this work we've done over the last 7 years, and we hope we can bring those ideas to you today. This is a big project, and we come to this discussion with humility. While we've been studying slavery in Connecticut, particularly Hartford and West Hartford, for the past 7 years, we are not all-knowing experts. We have changed the language we use, the approach we take to the history, and the focus of our work, and we're still working at it. We think about language a lot. You'll notice we use the term enslaved. It is a person who is enslaved. A slave, if you use the term slave, it really defines the person as only that. We want to put the humanity of those people who are enslaved front and center. We'll use the term enslaver rather than master or slave owner, so as not to make it seem like a natural system. We hope this forum will call people into this conversation rather than calling them out. We're all learning. If some statements make somebody feel uncomfortable, please name it so we can learn from this experience within this community. Earlier this year, Professor Eddie Glaude gave the James W.C. Pennington Lecture right down the street at the Wadsworth Atheneum. He argued that all of us are the leaders in this. Democracy blooms when people take responsibility for their communities and for each other, motivated by love and justice to tend to people. It is with this belief that we move forward today. Well, I'm trying to move forward. Okay. So it's really with pleasure that I introduce Sally Whipple, who is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Democracy Center, and thank her for working on this grant with us and welcoming us here today. When I was a young teacher in the early 1980s, Sally was the Executive Director at the Noah Webster House and also the head of Education First and then the Executive Director. And she did some incredible research on slavery in West Hartford, which I used in my classroom, and much of which has been the foundation of the work we do today. So thank you for welcoming us, Sally.
Thank you, Tracy. My husband and I were talking about my first museum job out of graduate school, my first post-tour guide job in a museum this morning, and I reminded him that I was told I was hired because he had a truck. And that's pretty much how museum work goes sometimes, but every once in a while something really special happens. And I was lucky enough when I got to the Noah Webster House to have many good things happen. One of them was having the opportunity to research and exhibit anything I wanted. And as Tracy mentioned, I chose to research and present information about what we called African Americans in colonial West Hartford. And I learned so much through that, pre-internet, sitting in the State Library every day for hours and hours, getting motion sickness from the microfilm machines. Yeah, and the other great thing that happened to me was that I met Tracy, because I didn't know anything about education, and Tracy taught me so much about education and how you can take information and turn it into something new for people and something exciting for people. So when we were approached to work on this particular grant and this particular project, it It was very exciting for me personally. And I love the idea that this is a grant from the Hartford Foundation that is to help deconstruct structural racism. And I like having this project with that goal because a lot of people don't see the connection between that goal and history. And I think Hartford Foundation probably didn't see the connection at first. But once you can help people peel back the way they understand the world and understand how powerful history is in how we think about our world and how we live in our world and how we carry ourselves in our world, that is everything. And I think that there are so many things going on in our country today, in our state, everywhere, and knowing history, I think, could be a good solution to solving some of those problems, and really knowing it, and really making it your own. And I think this project, as it's been laid out, really takes big steps towards that. So we are really thrilled to have this grant from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and to be able to put these funds to such good use. And I'm really glad that you all signed up to do this program. We have some of my colleagues working on this program too, and we're really excited to be involved because the Old State House has many, many stories. Many of them are still hidden, even though we've known a lot of the stories for quite a while. We're always finding new ways to look at them. So this project will really help everybody look at things in new ways, and I'm looking forward to see what comes out of it. And again, I couldn't be happy to have all of you here today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sally. I feel like in this room we're just sort of living in history too. It's just such a beautiful spot. So we want to just start off with a short video today, a short TED Talk done by a man named Titus Kaphar. And Kaphar is an artist who actually lives in New Haven. He's really world famous. We're going to pick this up in the middle, about 4 minutes in. Kaphar starts by talking about going to the Museum of Natural History with his children. And he sees this statue. How many of you have seen this statue? It's no longer there. It's been moved. But one of his sons said to him, "Why is one of the guys riding and the other two are walking?" And his son was maybe all of 6 years old when he says that. And he then spins his story about shifting our gaze from this particular interaction with his son. Okay, so here we're going to pick it up. Let's see if I can get it all queued up here. And so the big thing he's talking about is shifting our gaze. And so you want to think about that as you're watching.
Can I just say that in all the PD we do, and in all the students that we've taught, hundreds and hundreds, we always start with this. It's the best thing we ever start. Because it literally makes, kids particularly, but adults as well, it really does shift their gaze. In the years we've been doing this, since we retired, 2015, our gaze has been shifted constantly.
Yeah.
Constantly, we think things, look at things a little differently. And with the help of historians, people like John, and others. So we're hoping that this is helpful.
Okay, so we're just going to ask you to spend a few minutes just talking to your mates here about this idea of shifting your gaze and how it relates to what you do at your site. And then we'll ask you, maybe one of you can be a spokesperson, a sentence of what you came up with, and then introduce the people on your team. So we'll give you about 5 minutes to put that together. Okay, these are amazing discussions going on, and hopefully will continue. But I want to see if I can call you back together here. And I'm going to ask you to do two things. One reaction to watching the TED Talk, mini TED Talk, whatever it is. And the second is, would you introduce us to the people at your table? Because we'll be together another time, and hopefully we'll make some connections between the people who are here as well. So, do you guys want to start? Hi, Michael.
Should I say
Sure.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Sawyer. This is analytics. This is Alice Dorsey. This is Joy Lee. We are interpreters and intern here at Connecticut Old State House over here. And what we were talking about how Connecticut Old State House shifts our gaze when we talk about discussing here at the Old State House is how one of our main priorities is to discuss like the real hidden figures of Connecticut's history and to put them in a spotlight. And I think that's something that what a lot of other museums tend to not really do, is specifically talking about Connecticut or American history in general. They tend to talk about it in a more rose-colored glasses type of way of American history, where it's all about, you know, the pursuits of liberty, freedom, justice for all, right? But, you know, we start to realize that that's not so the case, and that's kind of one of our main priority things over here in the Old State House, is to discuss more about these people who, you know, fought for this concept of freedom compared to others. Specifically, we have the story of Prudence Crandall, who is our state heroine here in Connecticut. And although she did great amounts of work to become our state heroine, it's really the women who she taught who were the main figures of this Connecticut history, because these women were able to become professors and teachers to a lot of the free African Americans after the Civil War, as well as to, you know, become headmistresses into other schools, as well as be part of colored conventions as well. So, you know, bringing more of those stories is probably our biggest impact here in Connecticut Old State House, and it's probably how we shift our gaze, is that we're not afraid to talk about their stories.
Wow. Thanks, Michael. Michael was part of our grant last year, so we're building, right? That's great. Okay, the Hartford History Center, who's going to be your spokesperson?
Want me to be the spokesperson? Okay, hi, my name is Nancy here. I work for the Hartford History Center, which is Hartford Public Library, and my colleagues are Corinne Prescott and Pat Knapp and Brittany House, and we all come from very different departments. So I'm History Center, Corinne is a library-wide programming, public programming. Pat is the branch manager for the Campfield branch of the library, and Brittany does amazing work with people who are recent immigrants who are here to learn English as their second language. Is that correct? What's your title, actually?
Adult Secondary Education Coordinator.
There you go. And so we come from very different parts of the public library. But I will just say, and I hope I'm not speaking for you guys, but that was very, I think the thing that resonated with me with Titus's TED Talk was just the focus, shifting, like the focus, change the focus. And I think it's something that we certainly are all striving to do at HPL to, you know, to reach our constituency and these wonderful people that live in this city. But you know, we have a lot of work to do, as we all do. And so I think we're excited about shifting our focus.
Thanks, Maureen. Okay, Weathersfield.
Hello, I'm Gilly Johnson. I'm a museum educator at Weathersfield Historical Society. This is Joy Lizak. She works for the town of Weathersfield Economic Development. And this is Martha Smart. She's our volunteer research librarian at Weathersfield Historical Society. And one of the things that stood out to me in the TED Talk video was the quotation about what an amendment is. He said that an amendment is this is where we were and this is where we are right now. And trying to not erase the past, but also to acknowledge how we've changed over time and trying to capture both of those things. And in terms of shifting gaze, one of the things we talked about was Wethersfield's red onion. How this is a symbol that is all over Wethersfield, but the red onion has a very complicated, darker history that too often gets ignored.
Thanks, Gilly.
And
Welcome.
we've been shifting our focus for a number of years now. The lot of research on people of color, a database that we're going to be putting up. And soldiers who fought, black soldiers who fought for Wethersfield in the Revolution. We're going to hopefully put up a marker and a bearing up to that. So we've been shifting our focus, well, at least since the mid-2010s and
That's
even
great.
before that. I think the defining experience for me was a Kahana meeting on this subject. It was held in Wethersfield. And that was the time the Hartford Courant writers came out with that expose.
Complicity.
Yes. And she was one of the writers and the speaker there. And when they threw the floor open to comments and questions, I stood up and said, why is slavery taught as an expose? There was nothing hidden about it. Dead silence. Nobody responded. I said, it's because people haven't been taught. They have not been taught. I do the very young course at Wethersfield, and I've had people come in. We started the slave stones, so-called. And I've had people from Wethersfield say, I don't know they had slavery in Wethersfield. So we got to peel back the onion at least a little bit.
Yeah.
To make you realize that we were not only complicit in slavery here, but in the West Indies too. And that's the story of the one paragraph. Anyway, okay.
Thank you, Martha. Okay, and Old Newgate, Morgan?
Hi everyone, I'm Morgan. I'm the curator at Old Newgate. With me is Jody Paulsgrove. She's our curator of collections for the Chabot State Museums, including Cruz Crandall. We love your comments, thank you. And then with me is Bob Ravenseeger, and he is a professor specializing in all of this, all history, all the time, and he's one of my devoted seasonal workers. This is coming on our 7th season, so happy to have him. Comments, love that video, thank you. We've been shifting our focus at Newgate to incorporate formerly and currently incarcerated men and women. That's been one of our ways to kind of get to that underlayer. Part of this workshop and with our folks with hidden histories, we're more interested in our prisoner list, a list of men and women who are incarcerated. Specifically, we were just talking about, we have a list of quote-unquote criminals, black, white, indigenous, people of color, with crimes, and they are not the same. So we're going to take a deeper look at the black, indigenous people of color and their crimes and why they were there within the system, slavery of the early republic, and how they get there. I don't think that can be removed from the equation. Some of what we want to tackle. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. Liz, do you want to add anything here? Okay. Okay, so thank you so much. And, you know, as the day goes along, we'll certainly get to know each other a little bit better. But just to sort of set the stage here, our job today is not just to add on to the stories that we already tell about the American Revolution. It's not just to detail another individual story, but we're challenging you to tell these stories that have not been told in a way that shows how the different pieces are connected. The individual stories that we tell illuminate economic, political, religious institutions and who holds the power in these institutions. This is the only way we're, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. How do I go back? This is the only way that I've lost my place. Who holds the power in these institutions? The only way we're going to address structural racism, that is, this is a story beyond the relationship of individuals, but slavery and racism are held in place by institutions. The job is to tell a story that illuminates the story of your town or state, starting from people whose stories have been hidden. This project is to do more than add in a story about a black person who was free or enslaved. It is to shift the gaze, to tell a story that can illuminate the systems of power, like in the painting, with a focus on people who have been left out of the story. If I say more is written about the dog than the lace, than about this person, I am also finding out about those in power. Okay. We weren't doing the decoration first? No, okay. All right. So here we are I want to introduce John Mills to you. His work as a black genealogist and historian and his work with the Connecticut Freedom Trail are literally changing the landscape in our state. John uses his lived experience to research and tell stories that have not been told from the African American perspective. John tells his stories in the context of a world where structural racism underlay and underlies the politics, economics, religion, and social thought of the times. He wants those who learn these stories to make connections to the continued effects of chattel slavery today. So welcome, John. Do you want to click? Okay.
I didn't want to walk through the middle of the camera, so I just snuck around the other side. So I appreciate you guys providing me the time. I love that art snippet from that TED Talk. That was incredible. That's very interesting. And it really highlighted the idea of what you're attempting to do here is to get folks to refocus their gaze. What I've been trying to do, and hopefully it applies really well to what you all are doing here, is I've been trying to, in my work with Alex Brienne Corporation, is trying to align history to the dynamics of unconscious bias today, as well as to shift the idea of these stories being so traumatic and horrible that we don't want to tell them. And if someone's telling them, they're trying to shame someone. I'm trying to take that away and refactor it into telling these stories are empowering to folks of color, especially when they relate to their own genealogy. And thus, if you don't tell them, you've isolated them and you've hidden them from their own history. I'm trying to refocus that as well. So that's been my intent. Again, hopefully it applies well to what we're doing here today. That picture on the left, that's me. This is like, I don't know, 1973, 2 or 1972 or something like that. And that's my mother, that's my dad, that's my sister Rosalind, who got me into genealogy, by the way, in the late 90s. And on the left, that's me, my wife, and my 3 daughters. In the middle is my daughter, Jasmine Marie. Next to her is Andrea Yasmin, and the far left is my daughter, Alex Brienne, who is the namesake of my nonprofit. When I was a kid, my dad, I grew up in California, my dad was really deep into trying to make sure that I was really proud of my skin color, what my features were like. Because, this, it's late 60s, early 70s, California, and you've got MLK just being assassinated, you've got other African-American leaders who had just been assassinated. You've got the Black Panther movement starting up. You've got, the competing US organization in California, it's starting up. And my dad was heavy into everything they talked about. And then also, as you can see, my dad was very fair-skinned. And he didn't like that at all. He used to talk to me about wanting to scratch his skin off of his face. All of his brothers are darker, and he didn't like it. But so he was constantly trying to get me to be proud of my own self. And I didn't understand it, I was too young, I didn't get it. But I was constantly facing racism that I also didn't realize I was facing, or subtleties in unconsciousness of bias. You know, I remember going to school on picture day in elementary school, and they would hand all the little kids that little black comb, and the teachers would comb their hair. And they'd always look at me and just hand me the comb. That thing was never gonna go through my afro, right? But it was kind of a weird disassociation with everyone else. I was kind of unusual, I felt. I remember being the latchkey kid around that time. That was common. Women were going back to work. My mom was at work all day. And so we were young kids. You know, I was 7 years old coming home with my sister with a key around my neck. And my mom didn't like that, so she asked the neighborhood babysitter to babysit us, and the woman said okay. And we went months going to this babysitter before me and my sister, we were too young, before me and my sister told my mom, you know, it's not fun staying out on the patio all day. You know, we told her something that I didn't realize was bias or racism. Like the white kids were in the house and they forced us, me and my sister, on the patio, and we'd be teased all day. And so, of course, that caused some stir up. So we were pulled from that place. In retrospect, I know what that was, but at the time I didn't, and it was just happenstance. I told my mother. I remember as a kid of like 11, being taken to a friend's house. His name is Gary Tompkins. He was like one of my good friends. And he said, let's come home, go to my house. We're gonna have lunch there. My dad will cook us something. And I get there and he says, Dad, here's John. He's here for lunch. And his dad said, oh, what do you want, watermelon? You know, now I know, goodness, where was I living? But back then it just kind of, you know, goes over your head. And that would continue on into the 80s. I have incident after incident after incident into healthcare, into housing, into corporate America. Me and my wife were trying to get a house in '89. We're renting an apartment. And we go through the whole process over the phone. We had it all ready to go. The person was like, yeah, just come down here, sign the contract. We get down there. And the bell rings as we walk into this rental place, and the woman's in the back said, yeah, Mr. Mills, I'm coming out. And as she walks out, she sees who we are, and she says, apartment's unavailable. And she turns around and goes back to the back room. It just continued. Once I got into corporate America, it was much more subtle. It was, but you could see it. I could see how hiring and how the focus of a person and their own unconscious biases were working towards who they hired, even if they weren't realizing it was. I recognized how people saw the world and how they presented in the early 90s. Because now I was coming up and I'd be in these meetings and I could see how they weren't recognizing how they were isolating people in discussions where there was only one African American in the room. And I wanted to affect that really badly. Like, I was like, how do I change that? And I also came to a place where I realized I was doing the same things as them. I was hiring the same way as them. I was seeing America the same way as them. I saw value in white America. I saw less value in black America. I saw less value in myself. And when I came to that aha that I was just like them, it clicked in my mind what my father was trying to do all those years. I realized he was trying to stop me from doing where I was at. He was trying to stop me from getting to where I was at. And so that started me on this journey to try to stop others from being there. Good, God-fearing people that think they're doing nothing wrong. They're just aligning to a system of which creates bias. And they're not realizing it, because that's something you'd have to consciously be thinking about every day as you look at yourself in the mirror to stop yourself from doing it, because we were all taught to do that. So that's been my mission. I didn't know how to do it until I found genealogy. My sister started me into it in the late 90s. My grandfather had died in '87. I knew him really well. And late 90s, you know, it's 10, 11 years after he had passed, and my sister starts telling me about who he was. And his name was Mylan Mills. She starts telling me about his parents, Robert and Eliza. Eliza died during the flu pandemic in 1918. She's in the lower right. And she starts telling me about my grandfather's grandfather, so my great-grandfather. His name was Ned Mills. and he was an enslaved man in Texas. And I found that whole thing fascinating, because before this, the only thing I ever knew about slavery was that small little couple pages they tell you about in school. And it's the only time in school where we were like focusing on the African American experience if we weren't talking about exceptionalists. And I knew the handful of those, right? The Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X's, the Medgar Evers, the Rosa Parks, and the Harriet Tubmans. Like, I knew this handful of exceptionalists. And then I knew, oh, I'm somehow aligned to slavery. That's my time of the year. But now I really saw the alignment, like it's me. And so she's showing me all these documents. She didn't show me this one. This one's one I found myself recently. My grandfather used to talk a lot about, or he didn't talk a lot, I learned after the fact that he was really upset right before he passed away. He was upset about land that our family had lost in Texas. And I learned that long after he died from my uncle. And I was like, wow, we own land? Well, I recently found some of that land. It's hard to read, don't try to translate it, but ultimately, Ned was enslaved in Texas, as I said. He was freed on Juneteenth, and he started sharecropping. And he sharecropped from 1865 up through 1881. Basically, he's growing cotton and I can't remember all the things he grew on these plantations, and you give all your crops and everything that you've done back to the person who owned the property, and then for your work they give you a portion of the yield. And he wanted to stop doing that. He wanted his own land, and so he made a deal with one of the owners in 1881. The deal was if he provided 3 barrels of cotton every year for 4 years, that in the 5th year, that owner would give him 100 acres of land. But those 3 barrels, the 3 barrels of cotton or 3 bales of cotton, each had to weigh 500 pounds. So this isn't a little bit, right? It's like 1,500 pounds of cotton every year for 4 years. And he did that, and by 1885, he owned 100 acres of land. Why that's really important to me now, because I was alive, and my grandfather was upset about land that was lost, that my great-grandfather earned 100 years before that date, right? Yeah, it's powerful to me now, right? And all of this I've learned over the last 30 years. Anyways, back to the point. Ned also, you see him listed below, that's the 1867 Texas voter registration. Immediately after the Civil War, the southern states were being forced to enlist all men, which included black men, as a way to get back into the Union. And so Ned shows up being registered to vote, which is fascinating to me because at that time, that couldn't happen here in Connecticut. I bring that up because of the context about Connecticut. I think that isn't told right about that time. A divisiveness and a racism that was here that isn't really told. But needless to say, in 1867, he was registered to vote. Here it would have been illegal in Connecticut. Here's my great-grandmother. Again, I knew nothing about her that my sister was telling me about. Her name was Eliza, and she had her death certificate. She died of the Spanish influenza in 1918, which was a flu pandemic, and on it said she was buried at Hickory Grove Cemetery in it says Henderson, but it's actually Kilgore, Texas. So we decided to go there. And so in 2003, we fly down to Texas because we're learning all this new stuff about our family. So we fly down to Texas, and ironically, on the 4th of July, we find Hickory Grove Cemetery, and it looked beautiful, all these beautiful stones, all these beautiful monuments. And then we realized none of the people that were related to us were in this particular cemetery. And it clicked that this is a whites-only cemetery. And we noticed a lightly driven path along the side of it. So we walked that path into the woods where we started finding the names of the people that we were related to. It was an incredibly powerful moment for me because it not only, I was learning about my ancestors, it also told me that they were demeaned and segregated in life and in death. It also was powerful because I was growing, as we learned more and more of a pride for who they were. And I aligned that to my analogy would be if you ran a marathon and someone told you I ran a marathon. If you don't know what goes into preparation and your diet and health in order to be successful at running a marathon, you might not get the full appreciation of it. But if someone told you about the 5 a.m. Morning trainings and the scuffed knees and the blisters on their feet, and they told you the details that went into where they arrived at, then that idea of running a marathon all of a sudden is more valuable. When I hear what my ancestors endured, and I'm still alive to tell the story, I'm here. That's a message of endurance. Now all of a sudden I see them in an exceptionalist way, differing from the exceptionalists I learned about in school. Now I see them as exceptional because they persisted and they procreated, and I'm alive because of that. So these stories brought me there. Again, that gets to the point, which I think telling these stories are incredibly important because of that. We visited some of our Texas family while we were there, people I never knew. I didn't even know they existed. These are my grand aunts, Mamie, Roberta at the top, Elizabeth and Eula May at the bottom. They were my grandfather's sisters. So we're learning about them, long after they had passed, and we're getting this picture of them long after they had passed. Roberta in the upper right is the one that reported her mother dying in 1918, and she was 11 at the time. The picture is like haunting to me. I look at it because I think about like the time period we're at right now. We're coming up on 2026, and it's going to be a memorial for this country. And at the time of this picture, it's around early 1920s. So they were coming up on a celebration of this country as well. But come to mind, how would they have thought about that? Like, in looking at that picture, my mind goes, we're coming up on 250th, what were they thinking about how they should recognize and represent this country? Is it even a part of them, that celebration? I'll just leave that question with you and think on that as it relates to the African Americans today and how we present history. Like, how should they see this celebration? My sister talked to me about my father's mother. And, you saw how my father is really fair-skinned. He used to always talk to me about, yeah, I think there was like, Native American in our family, that's why I'm fair-skinned. We learned, no, that's not the case. My grandmother on the left, her name was Annie Idell Fuller, her maiden name, Annie Mills, her married name, and I knew her mother as well. Her mother died in 1984, and it was a joy to know her. She's in the lower right there. Her name was Toni Kyle. That Kyle name turns out aligned directly to this history of our country's efforts in enslavement. Her mother, Toni Kyle's mother, Mary White, was enslaved. Everybody you see on there on yellow highlights were enslaved people. And her grandmother, Marguerite, was a native of Africa and was brought here specifically to work for an Irish family. And the man of the house, I define it as raped her. And a product of that is my great-great-grandmother and my great-grandmother at the bottom, who I knew, Toni Lee Kyle, and my grandmother, thus the fair skin of my father. That's how that that occurs. My great-grandmother, Toni Lee Kyle, again, whom I knew, her father and or more importantly, her great-grandparents, or grandparents, I'm sorry, Sam Kyle and Vinnie Kyle, were all owned by a man by the name of Claiborne Kyle, who was a very famous politician in Mississippi and then in Texas. And his family, I mean, there are many things named after his family. The city of Kyle is named after his family. Where Texas A&M plays, the stadium's called Kyle Stadium. I mean, there's a lot named after this man that these people were enslaved by. Sam Kyle, again, that's my great-great-grandfather, was an overseer on his property. While we were in Texas, we were able to get a picture of him sitting on that plantation. And I've also recently, this is within the last 2 months, because for many years, a lot of the documentation in that area of Texas was not digitized. And so you literally had to go there and then, but recently a third party started digitizing a lot of the records. And so we found some documentation written by Sam Kyle while we were online. But also, anyway, Claiborne Kyle, that's the gentleman I was telling you about, who was the politician. He had 5 sons who all fought in the Civil War on the Confederacy. Those are those men on the right. And some of my family, at the time, over the years, I thought we were related to these people. I'm learning that there were portions of my family that were, my line is not, because he was doing as many enslavers were doing. He was raping his enslaved. And so there are those that are related to me that are also related to him. We went to look for my family in Texas where they were buried, and we found the same thing that we found with my grandfather's father, Ned Mills, and that is, in this picture on the left, I'm standing at Claiborne Kyle's gravestone in Kyle, Texas, but that tree line behind me is where my ancestors are, and we found some of them back in those woods. That's me and my father on the right walking through those woods. Again, the same power came over me. It's like they endured, and they knew that no matter what occurred in life, they're not as valued as the enslaver, the slaver's family, or white America, and so accepted the fact that they were all being buried in this distant kind of way into the woods. This is the document I was telling you about that I just recently found, where Sam Kyle was trying to take ownership of property that his father owned, and he talks about his lineage. It's a much larger document. It's an affidavit. And so, but I just cut out a couple pieces of it that kind of align to all the things I know. And then he starts, in this thing, he mentions the person I knew, which is Toni Lee Kyle, my great-grandmother who died in 1984. That was his granddaughter. So he mentions his granddaughter, Toni, in this thing, which is fascinating to me when I read it. He also talks about how he and his father were owned by a gentleman by the name of Young, and then they were sold to Claiborne Kyle. And so another document that kind of aligned my entire family to this country's history. On my mother's side, my mother, her father's name was John Smith. I also knew him really well. He died in 2007. He was a heavy naval guy, and saluted me. And every day of my life that I ever saw him, he saluted me. He died, and not knowing much about his family, he knew his parents and his grandparents. That's all he knew. But my sister was able to find his great-grandparents, and one of them was a man by the name of William J. Cooper, who fought in the Civil War, and he was also in the Navy. And we were able, which would have been fascinating to my grandfather had we been able to tell him that while he was alive. But he fought on various different ships. He was on the Commodore Perry, the Wyalusing. He was also on the Albemarle. One of these ships was actually a Confederate ship that the Union captured and then recommissioned that he served on. After the war, he would die years later, and his his widow would struggle to get up his pension, but eventually did. So we went to try to find her grave, or his grave as well. They were all from Baltimore. My grandfather was from Baltimore. William J. Cooper, his great-grandfather, was from Baltimore. And so we we're going to Baltimore. And then we found out where he was buried as well. He was buried at Laurel Cemetery. So we traveled to Baltimore, and it turns out that Laurel Cemetery had been paved over in 1957. And there were some 30,000 African Americans that had been buried there, and still under this parking lot. So I've gone down multiple lines here, right? Each line ended in some cemetery that's in the woods, stones missing, which is critical to a genealogist like me. It's you use stones to piece things together that you don't see in documentation. So the idea that a lot of these cemeteries are in the woods or don't have stones is it cuts off some of the paths for reestablishing the story. And now in this scenario, we have no stone at all because everything was kind of buried and paved over. And there's this pattern of this I'm now seeing, right? I mentioned that because, one, it speaks to this idea of endurance. All of these people knew this was the demise. This is where we're going. We're going to be segregated. This stuff. They all knew. And I started to realize that my story was not unique. This was the pattern, right? I think that if any African American in this country started digging into their history, they'd probably end in very similar channels, right? And so. And also the idea that my father didn't know much about his genealogy, my grandparents didn't know much about theirs, I didn't, and as we started to dig, we built this wealth of information that now gives us a new reverence for who we are. I wanted other people to feel that, right? I wanted other African Americans to feel what we felt and realize that when you hear these depictions of who wants to hear that sad story? Why are you perpetuating that story? Why are you trying to guilt people? You can challenge that with the power that you captured in learning it and the inclusivity it creates when people present it. And so my work has been that. It's been digging into stories similar to mine, not the exceptionalists, not the people we know, not the names we've all seen on buildings, the African Americans that we've read about in books. My work has been finding the little known person in history, the person that was not commonly thought of as an exceptionalist, and then helping redefine who they were based on their experience as exceptional. So that's been my work. Here in Connecticut, I just continue to find more and more people like that. It's just, because of the idea from the native Connecticut citizen in not knowing a lot about the history of slavery here, and then that dynamic of a commonality of the African American experience of not knowing a lot about their own genealogy. So as I dig into these things and I find out these stories about Connecticut and then also build this package of information about a person, it's been a very enlightening and a rewarding kind of journey. The Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment is one of those subjects that there are lots of stories like that there. One of which is their overall story, first of all, and how they came to be out of a struggle that Connecticut was in at the time. The Militia Act of 1862 allowed black men to fight, but Connecticut didn't start a colored regiment. The Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect in January of 1863 allowed states to raise a colored regiment, but Connecticut still didn't do it. And then in November of 1863, Lincoln is putting this pressure on the state of Connecticut because with the draft that had started in March of that year, Connecticut's quota was 7,700 men, and they had only provided 2,300. So Lincoln was like, you're 5,400 men short. What's up with that? If you don't supply those by January 5th, 1864, we're going to double that. And so Connecticut was under threat. And as a mechanism to solve for that, there was a proposition of, well, let's just raise the colored regiment like everyone else is doing, and then we can make up these 5,400 men. And that was like crazy talk here in Connecticut. You know, there were people going, well, we give African Americans guns, they're going to raid people's houses and, you know, with raping. Like that was like a scary thing in Connecticut, but they had no choice. So they raised the colored regiment. That one fact, to me, changed the whole context of that one regiment. It was like they were being utilized for a quota, number one. And number two, even in that, 1,778 men showed up from all around this area, not just Connecticut. People were racing to Connecticut because these black men were like, they're going to let us fight, right? And in doing that, they were promised a bounty, like a reward for enlisting that they weren't given. They were supposed to be paid, like the white soldiers, $13 a month, but they were offered $7. Like, so you're being used for a quota, and you're not being paid appropriately. And then the regiment was all led by white officers, so you couldn't actually be in leadership there. Like, you were just the core of the regiment. So, you know, again, those things talk to endurance to me. Like, they had to put up with this, but they still fought. Like, they look different to me now. That's not the same thing. And I read a couple books about some of the men in this regiment, a book by a guy named Isaac J. Hill, another book by a guy named Alexander Newton. Isaac J. Hill talks in his book about how he was in the field and a gentleman was shot in the head, a black man. He props him up against a tree, but then he has to run back to his station. He comes back and all the medics were attending, like a couple hours later, all the medics were attending to the white men that were injured, but no one had attended to this guy yet. And he says, it made a difference, the complexion of your skin, with regards to whether or not you were treated. Now think about this, right? These men are fighting for this country, and they know that they're not thought of the same way. They also both talk in their books about a lot of the reason they were fighting is because we're men too. We're trying to prove it that we're just as valuable as you. So it was just a completely different context. It wasn't about union. It wasn't about all these other things that you hear about from a Civil War perspective. These men, it was about honor and dignity and value, and it was just a completely different context, right? So I started digging, you know, into some of these men that wrote these books, Isaac J. Hill being one, and he talks about in this particular passage, he talks about how when they had first deployed and they were leaving New Haven and they were, the flag was raised, and he says on account of them not receiving their bounty that they were promised, they made no response to the presentation of the flag. Now think about that too, like really process what he says there. I've heard like, you know, Jesse Owens comes back from the Olympics and he's not invited to the White House, but all the other Olympians are, and you know, and he kind of makes a stink about that. I heard about the '68 Olympics where the black men are on the podium and they're making a stand to the presentation of the colors because they're not being treated well at home, but they're actually doing something great for their country. I've heard about Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf in the early '90s, and he was in the NBA, and he just wouldn't, there was turmoil during that time, and so he just wouldn't make a representation to the flag during the NBA games, and he got banned from the NBA. I've heard about Colin Kaepernick, but I never heard that right here in the state that we live in, long before them guys, we're going back to 1863, our black regiment here did the same thing. Like, to me, that's a powerful thing. I'm not sure why we never hear about that here in Connecticut. That's very odd to me. It's not odd to me, but it should be odd to me. That should be odd. He talks about when they're coming back. Civil War is over. They were the first regiment that walks into Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. And the 29th and 30th regiments from Connecticut are critical in that capturing of that city. They then go on output duty for some time in Texas, and then they're brought, the Civil War is long over, it's 1865. They're now finally coming back to Connecticut. They go to New York. There's a small parade for them in New York, and now they're sailing to Hartford. And in October of 1865, it was put up for vote in Connecticut. Should we let black men vote? I mean, they just fought for us. Like, let's think about, should we do that? So that went up for a vote, and in the state of Connecticut, the citizens of this state voted that down. And so while they're coming back, these men of the 29th learn about that. And so this is the bottom there is Isaac J. Hill, what he wrote in his book about learning about that. He says, they're not here yet, they're sailing back here. And he says, the boys of the 29th were feeling somewhat indignant in reference to the treatment they received from their state, it not giving them their rights. Like, so he's writing about it. I've heard a lot of historians mention Isaac J. Hill's book. I've never heard anyone translate the idea of, they recognize that this state is not treating them well. Like, it's right in the text. He then gets back here. There's a celebration for them right here on these grounds. The 29th and 30th are right there on the south side of this building. Governor Buckingham gives a speech, talks to them. In his speech, he's literally apologizing to them for the fact that the state of Connecticut is not allowing them to vote. The idea that they were even here is never referenced, much less the idea that Governor Buckingham talked to them in that way. I went looking for him. Like, where is he at now? I went down to the New Haven Monument, and there's a monument to the 29th there. He's not on that monument. I would learn that there's 200 men missing off of that New Haven Monument. It's not just him. Not only that, white officers would promote in the black regiment, because it was considered, that's a rough job. You gotta corral black men. So they would just constantly promote. The New Haven Monument replicates the white officers every time they promote. So if they promoted 3 times, they're on that monument with 3 different spots, right? Yet there are hundreds of black men that are not on that monument, and Isaac J. Hill is one of them. I don't think, for me, there's a shame in that to me. How these men, what they endured for this state. And yet we haven't found a way in this state to recognize the disparity in what they were fighting for and how they were treated, and at least just having somewhere that had all their names. We haven't figured that out yet. So I went looking for him. I found out that he moved to New Jersey. Actually, that's where he always lived. He came here to fight and then went right back to New Jersey. And I found that he was buried at Red Bank Cemetery in Woodbury, New Jersey. And in 1962, that was paved over for a parking lot. That's on the right. So his body's somewhere under that parking lot. So back to my own personal story. It's like, that's not coincidental, I don't think, that I've now run into a story that aligns specifically to mine. That's, I think there's a pattern here, and that it was paved over right around the same time my family's ancestors were paved over. On the left is stones that are now been moved to a cemetery up the street of those people that are under that parking lot on the right. And his stone is there, but it's not readable. This year, my nonprofit had that stone replaced, and so that now people can go and learn about him. We put a QR code on the stone, and so we've replaced that. That story aligning to value in the struggle and in the endurance. I actually found his family as well. He has current day descendants. And I handed them the whole outline of his experiences in his life long before he joined the 29th, as well as his experience in the 29th, his book, and what occurred and happened to him. They didn't even know who he was and didn't know they were related to him. So I felt a lot of value in actually giving that to them, and they feel incredible pride in knowing about it. There's a whole ceremony that's going to be happening on June 8th in New Jersey off of this story, of which the family's going to be there, based on that research that I provided them. Another story aligning that to me is insightful about how we read information, how we translate it, and what is empowering from an African American perspective, is one that relative to a man I was researching by the name of Prince Mortimer. He was an enslaved man in Middletown, brought here from Guinea, Africa in the 1730s. Sometime in the 1750s, his enslaver, I don't think he was enslaved with this man yet, but his name was Philip Mortimer. He starts a rope walk there, a building to make rope, which is critical to the slave trade and to just boating in general. Back then you needed like sails, so you needed rope. And he becomes incredibly wealthy. He purchases Prince Mortimer. Prince Mortimer works for this man for decades and puts in his will that when he dies, he's to be freed. But when the enslaver dies, the enslaver's son-in-law challenges the will and wins, and then Prince Mortimer is not freed, and thus he stays enslaved until around 1811. Prince Mortimer is some 80 plus years old. He's accused of attempting to poison this son-in-law, and he's sent to prison for life, and he's sent to Newgate prison. A gentleman wrote a little bit about this story, a guy named Richard Phelps, back in the 1840s, and he just has a couple of small passages about Prince in his book. The book's called Newgate of Connecticut. And when I read the passage, this small passage about him, my first thought was, wow, like, where is he buried? Because of my experiences, right? Like, I'm like, where's this guy buried? I got to find this. And also, in the tale, he talks about how he was, dark as night. And then that hit me because my dad was really fair-skinned, and he suffered from all this colorism all his life. So colorism hit me in the story, right? All these things were hitting me. But then I found this other guy who wrote a book off of the passages from this book. And this guy's name was Richard Phelps, Dennis Caron. And he writes a book off of those passages in Richard Phelps' book. And he starts talking about the passages, and he says, at the beginning of his book, he says, frankly, the passage didn't make any particular impression on me at this first reading. The appeal of Prince's story struck me only after I reflected over the dates that Phelps mentions. Prince died in 1834 at the stated age of 110, which was odd to me, because he's saying the only thing that was interesting about the appeal to him was that the passage stated he died at 110 years old. And his age didn't really hit me. What hit me was, where is he buried? The colorism aspect, the trauma of what he talks about, of him coming over here on a slave ship, the documentation I couldn't find, and that they didn't have in the passage about all the span of time between these years of him getting here and then him going to prison. The idea that he was in prison for life after, some 60 years of enslavement, because he tried to free himself. So I started thinking about criminal injustice and equity. The fact that the son-in-law was trying to maintain wealth, I was thinking about, oh, here we go, this generational wealth thing, and it's impacting people of color, and these fights for this wealth. Like there was just a lot in here that hit me from my life's experience perspective, that this writer, it never even crossed his mind. The reason I'm telling you that is I think the narrative of how we tell these stories and the perspectives that we have as human in our upbringings, play a big role in how we interrogate documentation, historical documentation. I learned that from this story. Like, who's reading and interrogating the document may dictate the narrative of the story. I offer that to you all who have heritage sites or museums, that I think if you don't have the right people translating it, you might not be telling the right story. I did some work on this with a group, an international group, that came together last year. We had folks from France, people from the UK, and we worked at the Ashley House in in Deerfield, Massachusetts, which is a heritage site, and they tend to kind of just tell the story of Reverend Ashley in that house. But he had enslaved people. So our project was to take over the house, and we're just going to tell the story of the enslaved people, right? And we were going to use like multimedia stuff. We had like augmented reality glasses. So the visitors would wear the augmented reality glasses, and we would be reenacting different roles of the people that lived in the house and telling the enslaved person's story. And we would be presenting things around the room in these augmented reality glasses as an attempt to decolonize the museum space. And that was helpful for me too. I learned a lot at being a part of that experience, but it was like incredibly powerful for the African Americans that saw it, as well as just the community in general, in learning more about these spaces and including more about a broader set of society in the space. That's an extravagant thing. I'm sure you can't do that in all of your spaces, but again, I just kind of challenge you to think about that. One of the things that we did in that presentation is there was this mahogany desk that they would always talk about within this room as it relates to Reverend Ashley that he used. But when we highlighted the mahogany desk, we started talking about the transatlantic slave trade and how mahogany played a role in that, and thus what that meant for there to be this mahogany desk in that room. So again, something to just think about. I'll end with, we're doing this work all around the state. I have a lot of projects in flight. So if anybody's interested in any of our other projects, please visit alexbriand.org and you'll learn more. Thank you so much.
John, thank you so much for that. There are so many things I'm writing down here to say, okay, how do I come back to that in, as we talk today? But your research and your storytelling really have a lot to teach us. Thank you so much. I'm just going to show you 2 more slides, then we're going to take a break. And we're going to start with this. Have any of you heard of a man named Lemuel Haynes? Okay, we got a few. Okay, so Lemuel Haynes this goes to colorism, was a biracial man born in West Hartford in 1753. He's really a contemporary of Noah Webster. He actually grew up in Granville, Massachusetts as an indenture to a minister. In 1775, he marched to Fort Ticonderoga. The next year, when he was 23, he read the Declaration of Independence and wrote this reply. His essay was called Liberty Further Extended, a 7,000-word essay. It's one of 6,000-word essay, one of the first written pieces that really predates abolitionist rhetoric, which comes 60 years later. He said, we hold these truths to be, well, he quotes the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He goes on to say, therefore, here Haynes is shifting our gaze as he explains the absurdity of a document claiming all people are equal, and it is illogical to exclude the black man. And so he says, as it is to a white one, and bondage equally as intolerable to one as it is to the other. And here he is really defining the paradox of freedom. Which is kind of the big idea we want to think about today. Like, how do we hold these two things in our head at the same time? And how do certain people embody both of those things? And so our project is to really talk about the black experience during the Revolution, both enslaved and free, And so it seems we need to think about the Declaration of Independence. This ties into our planning for America 250 in 2026. And I think it's really useful for us to rethink about the ideals that are in this declaration. The first, all are created equal. The second, government by the consent of the governed. The third, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the last, the right to rebel. And this declaration is really a document of, it is a hopeful document, right? It is, it hails the agency of people who want to fight oppression. And, you know, I think when we think about how we taught this as high school teachers, you know, we were talking about John Locke and the Enlightenment philosophers, and we were not teaching about Lemuel Haynes and how his life really personified so many of the ideals that are here. And when we were putting our our ideas together, one of the things that we talked about was how when we first started doing this work, when you're studying people who were enslaved, all the documents pretty much are written by white people. They're written by the enslavers. And so it is very easy to lead with the enslaver's story because you know so much about them. But the more we did it, the more we realized we really need to lead with the story of the person who was enslaved. And as you tell that story, you get the other story. Just like I was thinking what John was doing, his, I think it's your grandmother or your great-grandmother died in the flu epidemic. And so you're telling her story, and it's a big deal. But you're seeing it through different eyes, and you're getting to it in a different way. And so actually when we had this together, we had the Declaration first, and then we had Lemuel Haynes after, and I thought, no, we really need to lead with Lemuel Haynes, and then we can say, okay, well, what did it really say? And then it puts the Declaration into a little bit of a different context by doing that. Okay. Do you want to add, Lizzie? No. You're good? Okay. Okay, so we want to give you a 10-minute break now, but before you have some sticky notes on your table, and we'd like you each to take one and answer this prompt. You don't have a lot of room. I mean, you could string some together if you want, but what is gained when we create space for more inclusive storytelling about our nation's history? And I want you to write on a sticky note, and then you can just put it up on the board here. And then we'll ask you to come back at what time, Denise?
About 10:40.
About 10:40.
All right. You know, one of the things we're going to do is if I want to read what you put up here, it's really, it's great for us all to be chatting, and this is the best part, is to be working with other people in a safe space and sharing ideas. So, what have we gained? A more complete history, an appreciation of how complex and many little words how complex and many, I don't know what that says, our history is. It's an inclusion of all involved in our history. It's empowering to learn these stories and help us to understand our world better. Placing the centrality of slavery and the indigenous experience is the link through which something about the development, sorry about this, something about a development and identity and the development of our ideology of freedom. It's also an intersection of race, origin, and national identity. It emphasizes for learners, like about the immediate, intimate links they have to this nation's past and present. Provides a different context and therefore a different approach to the historical record. Highlights lesser known but highly valuable information for interpreting history and advancing the present historical, cultural, economic, genetic, and genealogy. There's the system. Let's see. Increased perspective, including the concept of perseverance, as can only be shared by people who have lived experience. Yes. Okay. And more accurate representation of our nation as well as giving individuals who have been overlooked the attention they deserve rather than being erased from history. I love this. We gain empathy. We gain the truth. There's a loaded word these days, huh? We get the full picture. What I believe is gained is the story of America, the true story of American history, and finally showcase the diverse blanket of our own country's history, whether good or bad. And hopefully we avoid repeating history. It gives people a personal connection. It will resonate. A complete picture, uncovering history and open heart history stories. Diverse perspectives, gives us interesting stories, and a context for the world today. Awesome. I think that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. All right, thank you for those. And one thing that struck me as I looked through them, sort of implied in there is a sense of belonging, right? Like how can you make people through these stories belong, and how can you, as interpreters of history, how can you get them to ask meaningful questions? And it needs to be complicated for that to happen.
I think I would just also add, we have to think about the next generation, and so if we want to make these stories open to those, to kids, to young people, we have to think of them as an audience, right? So we think that's really important as well. It is that audience.
Can I add something?
Yes.
I think that it's also important to make space for rage. That it is virtually impossible, in my opinion, because the stories of slavery that we have been told, I mean, I'm 42 and I'm just learning the real unwatered down version of what it meant to be enslaved. So I can sit in a place like this and try to keep myself composed and keep myself together. But if we're talking about younger generations who might not have learned how to compartmentalize yet, and we're having these very complex conversations, while they're also dealing with systemic oppression, we're talking about especially Black and brown youth in the city of Hartford, they're going to start seeing themselves because they are going to recognize the oppression of enslaved people with the oppression they are experiencing right on Garden Street or Albany Avenue. So I think that some way, somehow, we have to make space for rage.
We're going to put it on there too, so we have it.
Corinne, I just want to, I think you're totally, I really appreciate your comments. Do you think that learning about the institution of slavery can help students to understand power relationships today, or have words to be able to talk about it in a way that they couldn't if they didn't know the history?
Can you rephrase it a little bit for me?
Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's come at it the other way. Some people don't want us to talk about it at all because it makes people feel uncomfortable.
Yes, I think it is very important because even whether you talk about it or not, you know it exists.
Yes.
So avoiding the question, avoiding the hard conversations doesn't protect them or protect the people who may feel uncomfortable. It doesn't do that. What it does is it further isolates and divides. And it doesn't open up space for growth and healing and understanding. So when you're talking about the 250th, I have no connection to it at all. It doesn't mean much to me when I look at my history and how my family on my father's side got to the United States in hopes of the American dream and looking at what they went through. And in that pursuit of the American dream, they completely shut off the Panamanian, the Bajan, and the Jamaican cultural side of them to assimilate, really to whiteness. So they stopped cooking the native foods. You have a Panamanian woman who started making mashed potatoes and green peas, you know, so you're gonna have a hard time getting youth to connect to this rich historical event if you don't have conversations where they can go back to their mother, to their grandmother and say, where were we in this story? I know from my mom's side of the family, we only got from the south to the north because we were in a shootout with a white family because there was a white woman who claimed that she was whatever by a black family member. And they ran them out of Edgefield, South Carolina. That's the only reason why all of our family is in Philly. And we never returned back. So
can I say something? I think part of what she's talking about, you need to make white students aware of that power structure. And that may be a bigger task.
Well, we've done it, but it takes a lot of PD for the teachers. And I will tell you that's the thing that we've come across, that we've had to do the professional development so they feel comfortable. Because part of the issue is they want to feel that the administration has their back. They have hard conversations.
Yeah.
That's the issue in schools right now. But I also think that we totally agree, and one of the things that we do, that's why we work with teachers about using language. And then letting students have a say. And actually, I don't know if anybody went to the American 250, the Connecticut 250 conference. Matt Warschauer ran a whole day prior to the adults for students, for kids. And he said they were great. One of the things they said to me was, nobody asked us anything. And he said, well, I'm asking. And so I think that's a big push, is to talk to kids, talk to students, and let them tell you what they feel.
Yeah, and one of his, the name of his workshop was Seeking Freedom. It wasn't, you all have freedom, but how do people seek freedom? Michael, go ahead.
And I just want to say, like, I think it's also quite, not really disingenuous, but I feel like to be able to feel like the idea of like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to feel more comfortable about talking about like these type of stories. Well, these type of stories are not to make you feel comfortable. You know, that's kind of a harsh reality. It's because like a lot of the stories is also the stories that a lot of Black and brown students are living their day-to-day lives. You know, so to confront these stories and to confront these histories is also talking about confronting their stories at this present moment. Look at our nation right now, how not too long ago when we were having a pandemic, African Americans and other Black and brown people were still fighting for their lives during the whole Black Lives Matter protest. Even in the state of the nation when we're supposed to stay at home and protect ourselves, we are still fighting for our day-to-day lives to just live, you know? And I feel like to have those conversations and to really talk about that and to, you know, go right in front of the face of those conversations, honestly really showcases how much these narratives, these stories are very important because it also shows context onto how do we end up here, you know?
I totally, and I think John's point of view too about, you know, you have to hold, that's a paradox of freedom, you have to hold what the values are, where we're kind of off the rails, but also what the resilience is, right? And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about. That's, we think, that's how to approach it.
So thank you.
We're talking about, contextualizing the revolution with the 250th, and we're talking. We have the freedom here to talk about this in the context of living in a democratic society for all its flaws. But we may be on the cusp of the 250 of losing our democratic society in total. And so we won't be having this conversation perhaps a year from now. So I think it's something that, for all our flaws, there's something about what was set in motion 250 years ago that we ought not take for granted, because we may be losing it, folks. And this may be the last time that we can sit here and have this conversation and not feel as though we may be arrested. All of us, no matter what, but because of our ideas rather than for our own. So this is something to think about when we talk about the founders, largely, in terms of African Americans, mostly clergymen, like Lemuel Haynes, right? But there is a complete buy-in to this whole project of freedom. In their perspective, they're just saying, include us, include us. It's not the ideas that are wrong, it was the application.
We want to make it broader.
We want to make it broader, but we have to know that we are on the cusp of losing our freedom, no matter what our complexion is.
Even then, during the revolution, when things started to happen, we have a case of a slave, actually, which was part of Weathersfield. And he went to his reporter and said, this freedom thing they're all talking about, I have served you faithfully.
I wanted to.
Yeah.
I wanted to.
Can I just say, I think that's an amazing point. It's a tough one, I would think, for a young person to align with, especially from a perspective of you felt excluded from the alignment to this all wrong. So that if you felt included, then I would agree with you. I think that's how they would see it. But I don't think they would see it that way if all of their life they felt excluded from it. Like the idea of not telling this history, we haven't really told it correctly in our schools for so many decades. The idea that we're told limits us from even like drawing the ripple effects to challenges today. And so now we can't even talk about those if we haven't told the history. So now you have all these people that are isolated from the ideals that you're talking about, but now they're supposed to look at that the way you're presenting it. I think there's a challenge.
Yeah, there is a challenge, and we talked about like making space for rage and what does this mean to people on Albany Avenue. But January 6th was a space for rage. We have to watch out about like making too much space for rage, because we need to, in democracy, things are not solved by rage, but by talking like we are here. Like adults, not hitting each other and not killing each other and not giving into rage, but to act like human beings and civilized.
So don't talk about
because we might completely lose the ability to have a conversation like this 12 months from now.
I mean, not the January 6th protests, but like there's a lot of protests that I think were rage fueled that had a really big impact that led to the creation of amendments to the Constitution. Things that were pretty important, pivotal to the discussion we're having now.
Yeah.
And I would also just add that I think that's why it's important for all stories to be captured, because you get all different perspectives. Because for me, January 6th wasn't rage, it was entitlement. And to me, that's a big difference. And I'm sitting here filled with rage, very composed, very composed. And we're talking about, I think I forgot what our I forgot what the prompt was we were supposed to write when we first came in after we watched the 2 clips that he sent us. But the very first thing that I thought was making space. And I'm here, this is my work day, and now I am to go back to work with all of this wrestling inside of me. When we, as the state of Connecticut, have made history by declaring racism a public health crisis and have done nothing with it, when we know what the statistics say, we see what it does, we see what cortisol does, we see what stress does, we see what heart disease does, we see what diabetes does, we see what food deserts and food insecurity and being unhoused does. All of that is tied into structural racism. And so every single day, many of us are walking around not telling our own story and not telling the stories of our ancestors. And we are trying to buy into this idea of freedom silently. And so it is, and that's why I say it's important, because there are going to be times when you have things like this and you got emotional, and if I'm being completely honest, it's 4 Black people in here, and I feel like I have to be a representation. So I feel like I can't get emotional. I can't show the rage. I don't want to cry. I want to be stoic, and I want to be strong, and I want to not take up too much room. But I just felt the need to say that, because those voices matter if we're going to tell the full story.
And I think that's the message to Connecticut 250. We're on the Connecticut 250 Commission. That is the message. So the question is how it's translated, right, to all the communities. It is, I think, a challenge.
Yeah. John, do you want to add?
Just last thing, I hear everyone saying it's a lifelong, it's a lived experience of a lot of elements of impact. And then you're challenged with staying in that lane. Like it's not that simple. But I hear you. But
there's nothing simple about
it. I mean, it's the life lived experience, and all of these various stories that you are relating to, I've got the same ones. But you're being asked to set all that aside. I got kids, I got grandkids, I got people that have all been affected by this. I got people that I love dearly that were suffering through this all of their lives. And I'm being told to set that aside and focus on it. That's a challenge. I hear it. That's a challenge.
I'm not asking anyone to set it aside. I'm just saying that when we shouldn't be fighting amongst each other, we should be realizing the fact that we're having this conversation because we're living in a society which allows for that conversation, and that there's no business as usual. It's not like 1976 where, in spite of Watergate and that the system worked, that you could celebrate the history of the country, not thinking that democracy itself is going to be swept away in that calendar year. This time is different because there's a lot of people who do not buy into democracy. However, imperfectly applied, it is better to have the ability to change things through the amendment process, someone mentioned that, right, than to not have the ability to change, or even to speak up in matters of justice after George Floyd and so forth. And what did the comment of the White House at the time say? We would just shoot them, right? This is
Bristol.
We are all equally threatened at this point, everyone in this room, and because, and maybe some of the anger that I feel, maybe some of the emotion that I'm feeling is perhaps the fact that for the first time, we're all in this boat together, that we all might get our freedom taken away. And we all might, right? What's that?
Well, I do think I do think that this, this idea of the paradox of freedom can really help us here. And that we can hold all of this in that idea. So I want you to think about the idea of the paradox of freedom and see how we have used it in looking at the documents that you, in turn, will be looking at. And just a brief thing, that historians for a long time have interpreted the story of freedom, the Declaration, as a story of freedom and promises, and the story of an America that has progressed from here to here in a straight line, in giving out, dispensing rights to people. But we know that that is not the case. And this recent book by David Hackett Fischer is actually called, what is it actually called? It's 2022, American Founders, How Enslaved People Expanded American Ideals. And he has about a 100-page section that's about New England, which really sort of illuminates how we've got these sort of lofty Enlightenment ideals. What are people actually doing? And how are people's actions defining this freedom? And so this commemoration is going to be a reflection on the founders of the nation, but also a time to consider the path forward and expanding our realization of those ideals today in an inclusive way. So what we want to do now is to show you some documents and how we read these documents and tell the story. And so that we use with students. So there's a man, probably the most famous black man in West Hartford was a man named Bristow. And sort of like John's point, he was saying, these are people who are not, you know, Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman. And Bristow was a man, as you can see here, native to Africa, who died at age 83 in 1814. So he was born in the 1730s in Africa, came across on the Middle Passage, and the thing we knew about him originally was that he was manumitted. And the story from Thomas Hart Hooker and Sarah Whitman Hooker, who enslaved him, was that Hooker, he's freed on May 9th, 1775, just 3 weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And in Hooker's genealogy, it says, Thomas Hooker could not go off to war with the idea of freedom in his mind without freeing his man, Bristow. In fact, his manumission paper tells us that Bristow paid 60 pounds for his freedom. So Hooker allowed, I suppose, him to do that, but it wasn't as the story was told in his genealogy. And in this document, Hooker defines what he means by freedom. He says, I do grant to him, said Bristow, his full liberty and freedom from me and my service, that he may go and come when and wherever he pleases, without any hindrance or molestation from me. Now, when I look at that, I think, I wonder how Bristow would have defined his freedom, right? This is what we know and what was written. Now, we've gone to the Connecticut Historical Society to look at this actual document, and the last time we were there, we noticed something when we looked at this document, and I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but there are these lines that go across it. Can anyone see those? And what are they? It was folded up, right? And so this document is folded. And so to us, this document becomes more than a document. It becomes an artifact, right? Because Bristow had to carry this document with him, right? The law said at any time he could be stopped by anyone and have to show his papers.
And I might add, the story of West Hartford was never about that. You know, it was only until we started talking about it and we started teaching this. But the story was about, you know, he's free, and then he went on, and he did go on to build a mill. And
yeah, he became a landowner.
This is not.
Yeah, part of his story. Corinne.
So when you talked about youth, for me, and one of the things that I do outside of my full time is I'm a community organizer and an activist and advocate. And so I'm always trying to help find matches to help people connect and understand. And all I hear and see is stop and frisk.
Absolutely.
So when you're talking, so I didn't hear this story, but when I go and I talk to different groups and I try to help them understand how the importance of understanding their history, then you have a better understanding of where you are at presently and why it's important to know that so you can make the changes. This right here, this story right here is extremely powerful for inner city Black and brown boys, especially in places like Philadelphia, New York City, and Hartford, where at any point in time, simply because you have on a hoodie, or because you have on a white t-shirt, and because you're in a certain neighborhood, you will be stopped. And you're gonna be asked probably for your license or your ID or something. You're not gonna have the same document, but it pretty much is the same. And so how free can you really be if you lose that piece of paper? That's it.
And that's
exactly. Yeah.
That's what we always ask them, and they have a lot to say.
Yeah.
I have a comment. If they didn't have that from the master, they would have gotten something from the selectmen. And it was kind of a passport. Wanting to get first, it was a black. But that document was also on protection, as long as they have that. Because we have cases in North District where people were actually seized and taken to South Carolina and sold, and they weren't slaves.
If they didn't have that document.
If they didn't have that document.
Yeah. Or even if they did.
It allowed them to move around, which they weren't able to do before. But I like to think the only thing these people got out of fighting for the revolution was the right to pay taxes. That was the other one.
But this, you know, I think one difference is that any individual could stop them. I mean, with stop and frisk, and I know, like I think of Trayvon Martin, like that was the neighborhood patrol, right? That wasn't an official person.
Any citizen can stop them.
Yes, but, you know, it says he has full liberty.
But, yeah.
The paradox, right? And in his later life, it's a hard story to tell, because in the end of his life, we think he lived with his former enslaver. And in his will, he gives his worldly goods to the children of his enslaver. And one, you know, we speculate about this, but one of my speculations is that in the town of West Hartford, people knew him. And, you know, there's some anecdotes that he was an agricultural expert. And so if people knew him, then what happens with this? It's not quite as important because they know he is a free man. And so though these connections, it seems odd to me, strange to me, it may have sort of opened up a world to him where this was not quite so important.
So just one of the things I just want to say is it's only 30,000 feet. So the question, a document like this is really a good document to use because you can bring it right up to date and talk about it today.
To our point.
You know, so that's what we've been doing. And that's, and I will tell you, it's really powerful because the kids have a lot to say. And I'm sure adults will have a lot to say as well. So one document can take you,
Yeah, a whole.
lot of places. And a lot is complicated too, as John talked about. It's really complicated. But that doesn't mean you should do it, right? That's the thing that we are struggling. We sort of break it down. That's why we have to do PD with teachers. Because if you just threw this at a teacher and said,
It needs to be interpreted and contextualized.
Yes,
But
and
it's not like it reminds me of Calvin Chris. It reminds me of voter ID laws.
oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, where you have to have an ID.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's, yeah. So it's just, the system is really important, right? That's the other thing. We have to always consider what is going on in the society.
Yes, this is a legal system
Right,
which
right.
keeps
Right.
slavery in place, and even people who are free.
How about the
Yeah. Okay. In West Hartford in 2005, the Board of Ed named a school after Bristow. So we now have Bristow Middle School. So it's a pretty big deal. And there are naming opportunities in your towns that you should pay attention to. How can, because this is named Bristow Middle School, it really helps to pass this story along. Right? So this is a document which you can find these documents in any town. This is a Freedom Seekers ad, and 250 years ago. And one of the things that is really important to us when we tell stories is to show agency, right? Is to show that, to humanize. And these Freedom Seeker ads tell us something about individuals that it's really hard to find in other documents. But here we have a man who is called a mulatto servant. And so, we don't use that term today, but he's a biracial man. He is enslaved, so we know that his mother was black and his father was white. That also tells us that he was born here in the United States. Well, it wouldn't have been the United States, but in America, not in Africa. It tells us he's 21, 5'8". It gives us a list of all of this clothing that he took with him. And then it gives us the detail that he is supposed to have a forged pass. And again, agency, right? He's got a paper. And we don't know how Stephen Sedgwick knows he has the forged pass, but somebody must have told him, or he may have known that Jude was literate, that Jude could write this himself. And then the last piece of this, there's a lot. I mean, we spend the whole period talking to students about this. One of the things we looked at was the date 8/9/1774. And, he ran away, he sought his freedom on August 6th. It's a new moon on August 6th. Because it says he ran away at night. And so, we think about his plan. This man had a plan, right? That running away at night was a good idea, and when there was no moon. The last part, the NB here at the bottom, all masters of vessels are forbid carrying off said fellow. And this is one of those details. There's actually a law that says that. Masters of vessels may not carry off people who are seeking freedom. But when I read it, I think this must have happened, right? It's not there unless this was happening. And from where Stephen Sedgwick's land was in West Hartford, actually Farmington was, it was a piece of Farmington that's now West Hartford. It's about 6 miles to get to the Connecticut River. Could he have done that in one night? Yes. And found himself a ship, and masters of vessels are looking for people. They don't have enough workers, and you know this man is, you know, once he's on that ship, he knows he can't mess up, right? And so by looking at something like this, we can really get a sense of the agency of Jude in this case.
And the resilience, you know, again, go back to what John said. I mean, there's thousands of these newspapers that have houses. So these people were taking it. This is their.
This is freedom.
This is freedom.
Well, we asked students that.
Oh, yeah.
What, was this guy free?
Yes.
Did he feel like he was free?
Right there's it. And the kids are right to point that out right away.
Yeah, very complicated.
Yes, yeah, and a lot of them, they don't all say he is. And of course, we come across some of them. But again, one document.
So, and here we notice too, when we want to tie it to the bigger institutions, who is helping out Stephen Sedgwick? The Connecticut Current.
That's what you say.
Right? The Connecticut Current is complicit in this institution of slavery. Denise. Okay. All right. Who do I have next? Say it again. Okay. So we really want to be careful. We're not just telling a story and saying, you know, as a historian, I would say, whoa, this is such an amazing story. But the story needs to be related to a bigger story. And we like to say it's data with a soul, right? What is the story you're trying to tell with this information? And how are you tying it to the social, economic, political, and religious aspects of that society? I'm not very good with this mouse pad here. Oh, don't go again. Okay, so this, can I go back? Yeah. So this is a church record, and probably many of you have looked at church records, and this is something that was used at the Noah Webster House for many years. So this top line says, that's underlined in red, October 24th, Noah, son of Noah Webster, baptized. So the son, Noah, is the Noah Webster of Blueback Speller and dictionary fame. And that was the piece used in the house to tell the story. If you look at the bigger document and you go down 6 people, you'll find George, a Negro servant of Timothy Goodman, baptized. And then a few more down, Chris, a Negro servant of Reverend Mr. Colton, was baptized. So that helps us to put Noah Webster in a context. And we figure that there were probably 50 enslaved people in West Hartford when Noah Webster was alive, when he lived there in his first 16 years of his life. And a more nuanced view of this document, if you look at October 24th, Noah is the son of Noah Webster. Who's George? He doesn't have any parents, right? The way this is written. He becomes the servant of, just as Chris does. And so we know that the institution of slavery is embedded in this Congregational church. And you note that Chris is enslaved by, this is the, I think the the first minister. The first minister of the church. The second minister of the church also enslaved a boy, an 11-year-old.
And so the more you do research, like one of the hookers was also in the church, and of course he was part of slavery, back and forth.
Yeah, the second minister.
So the more you do the research, you know that's you find more and more. But what's interesting from our point of view is that we, you know, when we sort of start to show this to people in the West Hartford, what was the West Division, the minute you start seeing this, now you can't unsee it, right? So now your gaze has been shifted, so now you start looking for it in all the documents. And that's what's really important. We do that with the kids, and we started to do that with the people. We train the docents in our restaurants about how to use documents like this.
Yeah, and this, Timothy Goodman, when we discovered this information, in the center of the town, there was a green called Goodman Green. And so a group of people said, this Timothy Goodman gave the land to the church as, you know, military parade grounds forever, and actually still owned by the church. And the church voted to change the name of the green and to tell Timothy Goodman's story. And there's a descendant of Timothy Goodman, still a member of the church, who talked about this as well and what it meant to her, and she agreed that the name, you know, the name should be changed. So again, another naming opportunity to help to change the landscape of the town. This next set of documents focus on a woman named Hagar. And in 1714, Hagar is listed here in an inventory. I don't know if you can see it, but by the red arrow, by Hagar, 15 pounds. She's listed in this inventory, which is taken when somebody died, in this case, Richard Lord. He died. They send appraisers into his house. The appraisers are listed here. They go in and set a value on every piece of property in this estate. And here, Hagar is listed on the same line as a sorrel mare, a horse, which is valued at 5 pounds. At this time in 1714, Jerusha Lord is 15 years old. So she inherits this woman. Well, we think, I'm not sure Hagar is well, we think she's born around 1700, so probably about the same age as Jerusha Lord. And up above it, it also says she inherits 1/8 of a part of a plantation in Antigua. And she has 6 other siblings. They each get a piece of this land. And so we speculate that Hagar may have made her way to the Lord family from Africa to Antigua here. Jerusha Lord goes on to marry a man named John Whiting, and John Whiting had an account book. And so there's not much cash at that point, and people had account books where they listed things they bought and sold. And in this account book, which is at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, like the second page of the book, he lists members of his family, and at the bottom of the page, an account of my Negro, he says, my Negro children when they were born. And he lists Pompey. He lists Page. Here he lists Hagar. So this is the same Hagar because John Whiting marries Jerusha Lord. It says that Hagar had a boy, Bristow, who was born in December and then died. Okay, so we know that Hagar is a woman who bore this child, and so we're trying to kind of piece her story together. And I think, you know, as we thought about this, this whole idea of resilience, and you can see he lists others. In our research, we found that the Whiting family over 2 or 3 generations enslaved 18 people.
So again, 30,000 feet, nobody ever looked at this document before, so we brought it to the attention because in the Northern Westerhouse, they used to go on and on about Jerusha Whiting, Widow Whiting, and they do a whole thing about Widow Whiting, and they said, probably not do that. How can you even think about who Widow Whiting actually was? We have a lot about Jerusha, and as a matter of fact, we used to start talking about her and the Lord family, which Lords have a lot of presence in. Silent Hill used to be called Lord's Hill, Lord's Point, in London. The guy had a lot of money. We used to start with the Lords, but we don't do that anymore. Now we start with them. Now we start with these.
Do you think that the 9 Hebrew children, were they literally his children? Or do we think that he was just claiming them as his property, my children?
That's a very good question.
Because he's not saying who the fathers of those children
No, but we do know that Hagar would not have been his child because of the ages when she was born and when he was born. But we don't know about some of the others who were born later. Because these are born in the 1730s. I mean, John Whiting is born around 1700. So.
But that comes up.
But when was Hagar's baby, though, that died?
Father of Hagar's baby, yes.
Yeah, and Will, too,
possibility.
Right?
Yes, Will.
They say the boy born
Yes,
and then died.
possible.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
You go back to that, not baptism, but worship, becoming a member of the church.
Yes.
This is by letter from Groton.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was she living in Groton?
Yeah, so we know our guesses her given name was not Hagar, right? Particularly if she was born in Africa, that wouldn't have been her given name. And then she's forced to come here. She is given this name Hagar. She is enslaved by Richard Lord. Then she's enslaved by Jerusha, who's 15 years old. Then she marries John Whiting. They move again, so she's enslaved by John Whiting as well. And then she seems to go to Groton, and we know there are lords in Groton, so that's probably a different enslaver. And then she makes her way back to Hartford. This is a historical catalog of the first church in Hartford, which is right over here. So she comes back in her late 40s, probably, as a maidservant to Mr. Haynes Lord. This is Jerusha's nephew.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That tells the whole story.
Yes, but it's really a story of resilience, right? And we find out also that she has a daughter named Hagar. As well. And so there's a story to be told about this woman and her ability to survive, to have children, and we know that her daughter Hagar survives. She actually becomes a member of the church and a member in full communion as well. And so, you know, with those records, we're thinking, how much choice is involved here with the person who is, you know, are they Christian? Are they being forced to go to church? You know, how much agency is there? Okay, and this this is Jerusha Whiting's will. So she lives till 1776. She enslaves a man named Pompey, and according to law, when a person was older and could no longer work, you couldn't just free them and say, okay, you know, you're of no use to me anymore, now you're free, at a time when the person couldn't really take care of themselves. And this is evidence of that. This says, to taking care of Pompey, a Negro belonging to the estate. And so money is left in the estate for that. And then the other thing that is interesting to us in West Hartford, the appraiser listed here is Noah Webster. And so, though Noah Webster is not an enslaver, he's complicit, right? He is setting a value on people who were enslaved. And so he's part of the institution. So even if, you know, Thomas Hart Hooker says, I'm going to free my man Bristow, you know, there are institutions in place that keep this system going, and Noah Webster was part of it. This is actually Noah Webster Sr. here, keeping this going.
The story of Bristow and the fact that he actually paid money for his freedom, but that part of the story was
kept out.
Kept out.
Yes.
I mean, there is a whitewashing, if you will, of American history that's just an example of.
Yes.
Like, there's an effort by the family to only tell the happy, oh, our ancestors were wonderful because they just freed people.
Yeah.
Not to say, oh, this man actually bought his freedom.
But it's also an effort, and John talked about this, of the people who were interpreting the documents to not.
Right. Yeah.
Not even the family, I mean, the people who ran the house.
Yeah.
To not even discuss it.
Yeah.
So account books, I think, are really are a gold mine, really, but they're not so easy to use because it's just page after page, and a lot of them are like rum. But John Whitman was a man who lived in the West Division of Hartford, and if you read through his account book, he has several pages set aside from the other pages, which show that he traded with people who were actually enslaved. So here's a man named Page. He traded cloth, thread with him, and this is a good example, again, of agency on Page's part. You know, we think he, from this, that he had skills as a tailor, and that he had money with which he could trade and use his skills. Okay, so as we said before, the Connecticut Current is really complicit in this institution of slavery. And here we have an ad telling us about goods that are on the schooner Squirrel. And we see mackerel, codfish, blubber, ironware, tea kettles, spiders, basins, dogs, and a small assortment of English goods, and then at the end, a likely Negro boy about 14 years old.
What do they mean by likely there?
What's that?
What do they mean by likely?
Healthy.
Healthy and have a good disposition.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, you know, one of the things I know from Wethersfield, you were talking about the role onions play in the economy. This really helps us learn about the economy. He says in the end, for the above articles, he takes pork, butter, cheese, hog fat, tallow, or small furs. And so, yeah. This ad is a sale ad for a black woman, 18 years of age. The thing that's, you know, at first strikes you of, again, here's this newspaper selling a person. when you read it, there are things you can find out that, you know, we, I think, often downplay the skills of people who were enslaved. And now they're trying to sell this person. It says she does all sorts of town and country work. And so they're touting this woman's skills. And so it's not, you know, these people like this woman who goes unnamed here, were an integral part of building the economy of these towns. Also selling a girl 13 years of age. And then it says, inquire of the printer. And so these sales were going through the printer of the Connecticut Courant. And this final one, a woman 21 years of age, healthy and strong, capable of doing any kind of housework, cooking, etc. So again, this woman is skilled.
Again, one of the things that we did with the Noah Webster House, we revised their 5th grade field trip program. And when we go through the Noah Webster House, they took them through the kitchen, and they never spoke once about the West Indies. And we said, okay, we need to.
And they're using sugar, right?
They show sugar and all the herbs and stuff. And so we worked to revise that curriculum. And so now they have posters up about the Caribbean, about the trade. We actually talk about, I think there's partly this artifacts that we helped produce that they use with 5th graders. They have a broader understanding, systemic understanding of enslavement in the West Division, its connection to the outside world. That wasn't there before. But it's more to understand the connections.
Okay, so how can your story about slavery and freedom create space for more inclusive storytelling about our nation's history? And this is really about what makes a good story. What's the backbone of a good story? And we think, you know, that it needs to be bigger than the story of an individual, right? So it addresses the paradox of freedom. It includes agency and choice. It encourages people to shift their gaze. It acknowledges structural racism. It encourages dialogue and questions about our history in the present day, something that Corinne was doing. And it opens up ideas for civic engagement. How can you get people involved in their community today, which Newgate is doing with your prison program, right? There is engagement with issues in the present day. And so we think that telling these stories can really help build community and can really help people feel like they belong to the story that is being told about the past. And I would just reiterate that these stories, we think, help to call people in, not call them out. So it's not about shaming or, but it is in some ways about people feeling uncomfortable and facing some hard stories in the past. But the question is, how do you tell that story to give it a bump, right? To make it a story that we tell again and again, that has, I would go so far as to say, a moral to it, right? There's a purpose, there's a meaning for telling this story. And so I think it's really important to think about what that meaning is and how it gets reflected in the audience, and then how that story gets amplified. Okay.
Is there anything that we missed on this list?
Oh, yeah. What else do you think? Maybe we go to the library for this. What makes a good story? What else would you add to this? Go ahead, Maureen.
Don't you think that on this list, that if we're talking about people who've been completely or often marginal from the pages of the standard history, if we bring those stories to light so that children, like in this city, sees somebody and hears a story about somebody that looks like them participating in the Revolutionary War, that creates this personal belonging, this sense of belonging and personal connection that I think would help to give history meaning, right? And this sense of participation. I mean, the thing that's astounding to me is that this history's been here, it's always here because it was what it was, but why did it just not get told? Who made the decision?
Right, who has the power?
Right, who has the power? So why don't we just turn that on its head and just start telling the whole story so that everybody sees a reflection of themselves in this history?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting, and I don't say this in any way to call out the library, but I know it's the 250th anniversary of the library, and so I looked online to see the history that was written about the history of the library, and it starts as a private book society, and I read the names of the people in that society.
They're all complicit, at least, if not directly.
They're enslavers.
Yeah.
They're enslavers.
Yeah.
And so, but that's not noted there.
No.
And it's really a private society for about 100 years until I think the 1870s or 80s it becomes a public library. But it seems like that story is one that should be, I shouldn't say should, is one that can be told.
For sure.
To open up the institution and to recognize that past, because it's only when you recognize, I feel like, when you recognize you can repair, but you need to recognize first.
Absolutely.
Right, and so, and I think you're talking about this with The Onion, too. I mean, it's all over Wethersfield, and it's complicated. That's a complicated story. And it would mean different things to different people, right? How it is interpreted. So, you know, I think, you know, those are the types of things that are difficult, but are so important to recognize and repair, I guess I would say.
If we don't do this, we're never going to realize how really rich and layered our past history was. When we shut a whole bunch of people out of it, who were a part of it, what have we got left? You've got Wallace Nelling's pictures of the Webb House with genteel white ladies in genteel 18th century dress doing genteel 18th century things. And in the kitchen, guess what you have?
Right, people were enslaved.
A white person as a servant and cook. There's not a black face in this.
Wow.
That shows you how the colonial revival period interpreted our history.
So that's a whole other layer, right? It's like this. I was showing John this book before. This is the this book is called Slavery in Connecticut. It's 32 pages. It was written in 1935. So this would have been the 300th anniversary of the English settlement here. The first sentence says, There is nothing remarkable in the fact that the English Puritans who founded Connecticut held Indians and Negroes in bondage.
You got to go to this, did you see
Right.
the next page?
That's how he starts it.
Right, then the next page says, there are records which indicate the presence of Negro slaves very early in the history, but throughout the 17th century, their number was negligible.
I think that's a book that also denies that they had any trade with white students.
Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So I think what you're pointing out, Martha, is there are a lot of layers of this, right? There's the layer of what happened, and then there's a layer of how we talked about what happened, and then there's a layer of how does this fit with the other institutions, and then how do we talk about it today? Corinne.
I also like to add something that is probably very controversial and is in my pessimism, it probably never happened, but the first part is the question, how can your story about slavery and freedom create space for more inclusive storytelling about our nation's history? But then the next line, backbone of a good story. Unfortunately for many white people, these are good stories. They're entertainment. It is, I mean, if you look at the reenactment, they enjoy, but they leave out a very big part of the reenactment. And if you've seen some funny TikToks, you have some black people who show up in chains. And they are saying to the people who are reenacting, they're just like, yes, master, and then they're sitting there like, no, we don't want that part. We don't want this part of the reenactment. They're like, but no, we thought we were gonna tell the whole story. I say that because the one thing that's missing on there is reparations. You talked about repair. But if we're going to collect stories from people, due to systemic and structural racism, many of these families are still in poverty. And we're asking them to share their story, which makes for great marketing, and it builds up emotion, and it brings people out to see these documents that you showed us. But these are actual people's real lives who have never been repaired, who never got, they were supposed to get $13, they never got the other $6. Think about the GI Bill, they never got the home ownership that led to generational wealth. And so whenever we have these conversations, we absolutely need to include the repair part, which is reparations. How that happens, that's not, I don't think, the conversation, but we need to at least start including that in there. And I know that is something that is very difficult for a lot of people to conceptualize and to hear and to even understand, but I mean, they separated us in death.
Yeah.
We have to talk about, it's more than just getting racism as a public health crisis, whatever, statement in some document. It's more than that. You know, if we're not going to put any teeth behind it, it's just a statement, who cares, you know? If we're not going to really seriously talk about the wealth gap in Connecticut, we're not going to talk about how they took down the projects right over here on, what is that, Albany Avenue. From the projects, you can see these mega mansions in West Hartford. Literally, you have kids growing up looking outside. So when we're talking about people sharing their stories, it's more than a story. It is their lineage, it is their present moment, it is why they don't know who their father or who their grandfather or who their mother is. It is why they have the last name that they have. It is why they live where they live and may never have a chance to go live anyplace else. So I just want to include those.
So I guess in in other terms, we said civic engagement, but reparations is probably a better word for that. Because, you know, we talk about witnessing, you know, witnessing is different than seeing, right? If you see, then you can move on. If you witness, it puts you in relationship and asks you to act. And so reparations is certainly a more specific and pointed action of civic engagement.
And there are communities that are doing that. Just recently, Northampton has a resolution on the books for reparations in their community. So you were starting to hear that more and more. And that may be an unfortunate, the term good story. We didn't intend it to be that way. I believe you raised it though.
Yeah, like positive.
And we're talking about the narrative, what's hidden in plain sight. But thank you for raising it.
Yeah, that's good. Michael.
Even, I would also like to add different narratives about freedom, specifically as we always talk about how slavery and freedom. We also don't really talk about free African Americans in their time here as well. Like they also suffered a lot of racism and a lot of their issues as well. Like Joy and Alice and I have been looking about different other narratives as well during the time of the Revolutionary period. And we discovered that, Black business owners who also suffered structural racism, other free African American men who also suffered a lot of different parts of structural racism within Hartford and Connecticut in general, as well as even other stories where we also want to hear more about, for example, about other Black women who also suffered a lot of their issues here, but their stories are yet to be told, or even so hard to even find some narrative about Black women who have suffered. So there is, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, different ideas of how to address those paradoxes of freedom with different other people who their stories are yet to be told as well. Even, we always talk about, the Black patriot, but what about the Black loyalist? Their ideas of freedom is also very different as well, and how their concepts could be different. Like maybe being a turncoat also meant that's the only way I can get freedom from that as well.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think those also different concepts of what does it mean to be free, and if you have to betray your nation to be free, that is part of the concept of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really well taken, Michael, and I do think it's easy for us to say, well, everybody in the revolution, every Black person in the revolutionary time period was enslaved, but it's just not. It's not so, and so that distinction is really important too. And we would say, there's those who were free were not didn't have total freedom. Right? Because there were all these strictures on where they could go and what they could do and what they had to carry. And but those, it's good not to, just have one monolithic group because it's just not so.
So, Jared Hardestay talks about disentanglement. So it's disentanglement from racist society and people who were enslaved, people who were free, people who were indigenous, and that idea of disentanglement.
I took notes on all of that. Yeah. We will modify that slide. That was really good.
Yeah.
We'll start with that next time.
Yeah.
Language is important, so it was
Yeah.
really good.
That's great. All right, so we're coming to an end here. Our next steps, we would really like you to fill out a feedback form, which is in your email now.
Email it to you.
And so if you're here and you've got a computer, you might just do it now. We hope that your next step is to identify and develop a story that illustrates the paradox of freedom and that you can tie to the institution of slavery that addresses structural racism. You can email us with your questions. At the beginning of next week, we're going to meet with each group on Zoom to get a sense of what your story is, what your project is, and how we can help you with that. And then we hope to make a site visit sometime this summer, bringing us back together on September 11th, 2024. So are there any questions or comments at this time?
Just need to get your parking tickets.
Oh yeah, get your parking tickets validated, and thank you so much for your participation today.